You're listening to the Economics and Country Risk podcast from S&P Global Market Intelligence. In each episode, our experts will provide you with the where, how, and when to make decisions that transform your business.
Welcome. My name is Carlos Cárdenas, and I lead our Latin America Insights and Analysis team. I am joined today by three members of our Brazil team. We have Elsa Rosales, Senior Analyst, Carlos Caicedo, Senior Principal Analyst, and also our Chief Economist for Latin America, Rafaela Miel. Brazil is a country of strategic importance. It is Latin America's largest economy and a very important emerging market. President Lula took office on the 1st of January, and since then he has been very active both domestically and internationally. Today, we're aiming to talk about his plans to project Brazil globally, to talk about the state of the economy, and of course about the political and business-related challenges that Lula faces, but also that companies that operate in Brazil will have to face. Let's start with Elsa to talk a little bit about the plans of Lula to project Brazil globally. Elsa, as I mentioned, Lula took office on the 1st of January, and since taking office, he has pretty much been traveling across the whole world. He has met leaders from the US, China, Germany, the UAE, and also several leaders across Latin America. What is Lula pursuing? What is he trying to achieve globally?
Hi, Carlos. Thank you very much, firstly, for having me. When we're talking about Lula's foreign policy, I think it's important to note that really his foreign policy is twofold. There's kind of two different branches of what he's trying to do here. The first main goal here is looking for growth opportunities for Brazilian business. But the second one is really looking to expand some of these more geopolitical ambitions. Now, on the business side, as you say, multiple trips have already taken place. So Lula's been traveling a lot, and these trips are really designed to promote international partnerships. So we're looking at expanding trade and using that as a way to generate opportunity for Brazilian businesses. Now, on the geopolitical side, what Lula's really looking to do is trying to cement Brazil's position as the largest economy in the region. But beyond that, using that aim and those efforts to strengthen Brazil regionally as a springboard to increase Brazil's position or more globally on the world stage. There's a number of ways Lula's looking to do this, including more participation in international forums. So, for example, Brazil will be taking over the G20 presidency on the 1st of December 2023. As part of this, they'll be hosting that 2024 G20 conference in Rio de Janeiro. Lula has also put in a bid to host COP30. This COP will be taking place in 2025. He's bid for that to take place in the Amazon city of Belém. So what we're seeing here is Lula looking to position not only the country, but also himself as president as a representative of emerging economies more broadly. So part of that is looking to unite Latin American interests, but also looking at promotion and strengthening of BRICS, as well as a focus on broader global concerns that relate to emerging economies. So around that, we're looking at things like de-dollarization, but also looking to increase pressure and cooperation with developed economies over commitment to climate financing and those pledges for climate funding. So if we're boiling this down, ultimately what Lula's looking to do is deepen some of Brazil's global partnerships while also asserting Brazil's autonomy as a regional leader and as a leader of emerging economies more widely.
And within that strategy, Elsa, obviously there's a big aspect in terms of the Brazilian business. Is there any sector that he's trying to position abroad, any type of opportunities that he's trying to pursue at the sector level?
Yeah, absolutely. We're looking at championing sectors that are driving growth. So particularly things like agribusiness, oil and gas infrastructure, iron ore, but also telecommunications and technology. Lula will be releasing a new plan detailing the growth acceleration strategy probably around the end of May. So we don't have full details of that, but we do have some early indications that suggest that alongside quite a heavy focus on social development, the key industries for focus in that plan will probably be oil and gas infrastructure, as well as telecommunications. So we would expect this to set out plans to accelerate investment in those areas. That will probably include both concessions and public-private partnerships. There are also some sector-specific plans. So, for example, we've got an oil and gas plan with the aim of making Brazil the world's fourth largest producer. Now, in order to achieve that goal, that would require an increase in production from around 3 billion barrels a day to 5.4 million barrels a day by 2029. So we're looking at some quite significant need for investment there. But beyond these, there are also existing key sectors that are likely to continue to be a major focus for Lula. So particularly including agribusiness and iron ore. And it's not just looking for investment in these sectors, but also investment in infrastructure that would support their growth. So things like investment in roads, investment in rail, and investment in ports that will support increased connectivity, that will allow exports and imports to move around more easily. So overall here, we're looking at a strategy that both aims to attract investment in new industries while also supporting some of those key growth sectors that already exist.
You mentioned agribusiness and iron ore. One of the things that impressed us the most out of the trips that Lula made was his visit to China last month. And obviously, China is the main buyer of a lot of the commodities that Brazil currently produces. Can you tell us a little bit about what he pursued in that trip and what he achieved?
Yeah, absolutely. And when we're talking about China, we're actually looking at two trips here. So first we had the business seminar in late March, of course, and then we had the trip led by Lula in mid-April. So on both occasions here, we saw large delegations of hundreds of business representatives joining those trips, and alongside lawmakers and ministers who were also involved. Now, the China trips are really interesting because they really represent a coming together of those two objectives that we were talking about. So on the one hand, we saw multiple agreements signed that are deepening some of those trade relationships, and that includes agreements between private sector companies, as well as more bilateral agreements on wider trade cooperation. So there we're seeing some of those efforts to generate business opportunities within Brazil, deepen that cooperation in terms of trade. But on the other hand, we also saw some agreements reached that furthered some of those more geopolitical ambitions. So, for example, there were agreements surrounding facilitating trade in local currency rather than dollars. Now, of course, these agreements are likely to expand Brazilian exports to China, particularly, as you say, in agribusiness, iron ore, mining, but also manufacturing as well. But beyond those agreements around bilateral trade and exchange of products, there's also a slight shift here because we also saw agreements around knowledge sharing and investment in Brazil development. So there is a use of these trips to support kind of a route to further development as well. So things like supporting tech development and capacity building. So within that trip, there were discussions of technology for sustainability, as well as Chinese investment in telecoms infrastructure. So all of this much more technological development that's aimed at, again, supporting some of that more sectoral growth. But I also wanted to point out, alongside China, in terms of Asia-Pacific cooperation, it also goes broader than that, because, of course, Lula's just returned from the G7 summit in Japan, where he participated in around 11 bilateral meetings, including with various other Asian leaders, including Indonesian, Vietnamese, and Japanese and Indian, where he again was discussing expanded trade. But again, we saw some discussion around those issues around climate and food security as well.
Thank you, Elsa. Before we go to the other panelists, my last question to you, what about the other regions? What is his main priorities for the rest of the world?
Outside of the Asia-Pacific region, Lula has focused quite heavily on cooperation within Latin America, so particularly through Mercosur. And there again, we're seeing some of these goals that we were talking about. So Lula here is looking to position Brazil as a leader within the region itself. And again, there are initiatives here both on that business side and on more of that geopolitical side. So beyond Mercosur as a trade bloc, there's also initiatives to support further integration, including the suggestion of this common currency initiative. And this is very much in early stages, and viability is certainly not assured there. But the existence of these initiatives reflect Lula's effort to strengthen that regional prominence, as well as that slightly more autonomous approach. Lula has also sought to strengthen cooperation with Middle Eastern countries outside of the region, particularly looking to attract investment from Middle Eastern sovereign wealth funds. For example, a subsidiary of the Saudi Arabia Investment Fund has entered into a joint venture with Brazil to produce halal meat. We've also seen investments from the UAE Investment Fund for signing an agreement for development of sustainable aviation fuel. The final thing to mention, of course, is that Lula is engaging in ongoing negotiations to secure ratification of the EU-Mercosur deal. Now, this has been completed in 2019, but there have been a number of obstacles to ratification, so particularly those environmental concerns. These are broad-ranging attempts that go beyond Latin America and they go beyond APAC. So we are looking at attempts to engage very internationally here.
Thank you, Elsa. Lots of ambitions from Lula, lots of plans and efforts to try to promote Brazilian businesses, but the economic reality in Brazil, it's also a bit challenging. Rafael, what are your main concerns with Brazil's economy? What is your outlook at the moment? Do you see the economy growing this year? And how do you see the economic environment overall?
The outlook for Brazil is one of deceleration. This is not surprising. It's more the behavior of the global economy. After the rebound of 2021 from the pandemic, 2022 was relatively strong at 3%, and then we're forecasting 1.6% growth this year. Growth is still being driven by an increase in consumption, which in turn has some credit support despite the tight monetary policy, the tighter liquidity and credit conditions, and the higher interest rates. Also, the reopening of China, a little bit of help from the external sectors, exports are growing also, supporting the expansion. At 1.6%, we've been for several months, I would say more than a couple of quarters, on the optimist side for Brazil, because other forecasting houses were calling for 0.5%. They will converge to our forecast. But the point is that, yes, we see still some consumption growth. We see reopening a little bit exports and the global economy in general. But this is not fantastic growth. There's a lot of things to do. Brazil has potential. Brazil has always been the country of the future, very large geography. The size of the population is incredibly high, abundant natural resources in the country, and a very decent size of the middle class, which creates a very interesting domestic market. Yet, we don't see some macroeconomic management, and this is on demand. They're trying to fix this. And clearly, we welcome the initiatives of the president to foster growth, but we don't see Brazil growing without the leadership of the private sector. And major concerns, you asked me, well, besides the global risk, domestically, Brazil has to solve infrastructure problems. Brazil has to come with reforms to make the productive sector more efficient, so to increase productivity. And in the very near term, we will discuss inflation and fiscal accounts.
You mentioned, Rafael, the private sector. What is it that's hampering that growth, or what is it, in a way, helping the economy grow?
When I talk about growth drivers, I didn't mention explicitly investment because this is the key part. If there are no certainty about the management of public finances, the risks of investing in Brazil go higher, because not that Brazil will act as Argentina to finance fiscal deficits by printing money, but still the debt could increase, and that will mean higher interest rates, that will mean more uncertainty down the road. So Brazil needs to talk about, and it's doing that. There's a big fiscal framework, need to come with a long-term credible solution to its fiscal situation.
So you mentioned fiscal situation. I think at the moment, the fiscal situation and inflation are two big economic issues that are arguably the most important ones at the moment on Brazil. I want us to talk about both of them. With regards to the first one, how difficult it is at the moment that the fiscal position of the country, how precarious is the situation in terms of the fiscal deficit?
Yes. Well, Brazil have made sizable progress. If we look back to 2016, the fiscal deficit went to a record high of 30%. If you see the deficit from 10%, 11% of GDP going down to 4% of GDP, that's sizable improvement. And this has to do with the fiscal anchors that were defined. So this was regulation, this was a constitutional amendment. Now the spending cap in Brazil called for spending, real spending, not to grow at all for 20 years. It will grow, nominal spending will grow according to inflation, but beyond inflation, the government could not spend more. And there was also the golden rule, which calls for not having new debt to finance current spending. So this is work. There was a pension reform also. There's been a labor reform. So there's been some reforms lately in the past 5 years that have helped Brazil to improve their fiscal accounts. But this has to go further. The spending cap during the pandemic, the deficit was almost to 15% of GDP. But by the same token, you see Brazil move back and resume the path of lowering fiscal deficits. Now, with the new administration, Elsa pointed very well the ambitious plans of the new government, and they want flexibility. The spending cap is not for a government that wants to spend a lot of money in different projects, infrastructure projects, which is fine. So they need room to spend more. In Brazil, we should see a 1.5% to 2% surplus, primary surplus. We were almost there, but things are changing because the deficit is increasing now. There are some revenues that the government had last year that are not going to happen this year. Brazil is in a very good position to make a very good commitment to fiscal prudence, to fiscal responsibility. What's being discussed in Congress now may be a major reform, but the new fiscal framework has to be approved, has to be implemented, and has to be observed.
The approval of Congress is absolutely necessary for what you say, and I would like Carlos to speak a little bit about that as well when we go to the political part. But one last question, Rafael. Inflation, I understand there has been also an improvement, but we know there's also some sort of situation with the central bank as well. What's happening with inflation at the moment?
Brazil, same in the rest of the world, accelerated in the post-pandemic supply chain distortions, new economy that we found ourselves in 2021, 2022. In Brazil, the situation worsened because the drought hurt significantly the production of hydroelectric power, and Brazilian inflation was growing in 2021 and peaked in April 2022, 12.1%. But then weather conditions improved and they managed to reduce tariffs for electricity for residential and commercial and industrial purposes. So now inflation is at 4.1%. But the central bank, which acted very aggressively against inflation and increased the policy rate from 2% all the way to 13.75%, is reluctant to cut the rates. The major argument of the central bank is service inflation is still very high and not declining. Core inflation, which is the inflation that excludes the more volatile items in the consumption basket, which are energy and related items, is still relatively high, closer to 7%, not to the 3.5%, which is the target of the central bank. Monetary policy is very restrictive, but the central bank is not ready now to cut the rates. It has triggered a reaction by the government, especially by the president, calling for a less aggressive monetary policy. I think the problem has only delayed the rate cuts. without government intervention, the rate cuts may have happened already in June or in May this year. We see in our forecast that inflation is declining. The external factors that push inflation during the post-pandemic era are almost vanishing. Oil prices have stabilized and are much lower than last year. Food prices in international markets have declined for 13 consecutive months, and supply chains are mostly healed. So those external factors are vanishing from the inflation picture, but we will see services and core inflation more difficult to reduce, but still we see that this is going to happen down the road, and Brazil will have inflation below 4% next year. And when the central bank will cut the rates, in our forecast, we're talking about second half of this year, now most likely end of Q3 or in Q4, because to make sure inflation expectations are under control, that the public, that the corporations, that all economic agents are certain that inflation will be low and will be controlled by the monetary authority.
Thank you for that, Rafael. Carlos, like Rafael mentioned, the government is saying a lot about inflation as well, and there has been some criticism of the central bank. Do you see the central bank independence in jeopardy in Brazil?
Thank you, Carlos. No, necessarily. I think, as Rafael, when he ended his commentary, he said that inflation is now going down. That is going to reduce a little bit the heat on the inflation issue. What President Lula has been doing since January essentially is making a lot of political noise on interest rates, and the main reason is that he promised poverty reduction, he promised strong economic growth, and he is aware that with interest rates at more than 30% is a big break on economic growth. He's aware of that. He knows the central bank is independent, and what he does is to make all these statements of public criticism to try to put pressure on the president of the central bank to cut interest rates, which the bank is not going to do. But then there are two things that I believe are going to reduce the heat here. One is the significant decline in energy and fuel prices and electricity. And the second one is the lower house passed the fiscal framework with essentially, and we might remember when there were all discussion about inflation, interest rates, independent of the central bank, the president of the central bank, Mr. Roberto Neto, said, we need the fiscal policy to be supportive of monetary policy, meaning we need a clear fiscal policy, a clear indication that is going to be a responsible fiscal management. By passing the new fiscal framework, I think it's still the Senate has to pass that. It's going to happen next week. But the government was basically celebrating yesterday because that indicates that if that fiscal framework is passed, it's an indication of significant improvement in the fiscal management, and therefore an additional reason why interest rates will come down. When interest rates come down and this law is passed and approved by Congress, I think the confrontation between the President Lula and the central bank will decrease significantly. But nonetheless, even if Lula wanted to change the monetary policy, he cannot, because legally the central bank is independent.
No, thank you, Carlos. And a positive development that we had the first approval of the fiscal framework. Obviously, the relationship with Congress is extremely important. The other big reform that we have ahead is the tax reform. Is that something that it's being postponed? Is it happening simultaneously? How do you see the outlook there?
Well, that's the other positive development I could gather from yesterday's statement from the head of the lower house, Arthur Lira, and from Mr. Pacheco in the Senate. They said, well, this vote is quite positive, and now we can look with optimism towards the tax reform. Essentially, the signal sent by the Congress, the same way, but that we support the government on the fiscal framework, we are going to support the government on the passage of the tax reform. Now, the tax reform is not a super revolutionary fiscal change, but there are a couple of things that will help the business environment. One, 50% of that tax reform is the simplification of consumer taxes or VAT in Brazil. Brazil has different kind of VAT. The municipalities have one, the states have another one, the federal government has another one, and it's a nightmare for accountants and companies when they're going to do the tax return every year. If the VAT is simplified into a single VAT applicable to across the country, that would be a significant development in the context of the crazy environment of taxes in Brazil. The other thing that Lula is proposing is to increase some taxes on certain sectors like dividends, banks, online platforms, and also they are considering reducing in a selected manner a good number of tax benefits from different sectors. Some sectors will not affect it, other sectors will be affected. But if at the end of next year, after the reform is passed, we see unstable fiscal numbers and a stable public debt, I think the market will be relieved because the government would be in that context showing really commitment to fiscal responsibility. There is some projection there, for example, for the government to reach a primary surplus in 2025 and by 2026, another second primary surplus. And therefore, if that happens, the trajectory of the public debt will go down at least slightly, and that would be good news for Brazil.
And Carlos, what about any other initiative that he might be pursuing in Congress or that would require the approval of Congress?
It's important to talk about the dynamics in Congress. And I think this is quite important. To sum it up, if you look at Lula, the first two administrations in 2003 and 2010, one of the key features was that Lula really had clear majority in Congress, and he pushed a lot of policies and they were stamped by Congress. This time, the situation is different. This time, Lula doesn't have the same control, the same room for maneuver with Congress. And that's not bad news because if President Lula attempt to move quite radical to the left, Congress is not going to accept that. This Congress is more conservative. This Congress has much power. And what we have seen in the first months of Lula is the only way he can move forward and implement policy is by reaching agreements and compromise with Congress. This is important in the context of policy making. If Lula decides to move to the left aggressively, he has to pass many of these laws by Congress, and Congress is not going to approve them. In that context, there are two issues that have been creating concerns in the markets. One is his threat to renationalize Electrobras. He said, I do as much as I can to push back on the Electrobras nationalization. Now, that is not possible. He's not going to have the number. He will have to go back to Congress and get the votes there. He's not going to get the votes. In addition to that, there is some calculation back on the envelope for some people in the sector that the Brazilian state, if they want to renationalize Electrobras, will need $200 billion at least to compensate their shareholders. From where that money is going to come from, there is no a source for that money. The other thing that he has been doing is on the sanitation law, which is one of the most important laws passed by the previous government, with open opportunities for investment in infrastructure. He's not happy with the framework of the law. He's trying to push that back. But then 2 or 3 weeks ago, the lower house rejected a couple of decrees by Lula that were trying to push back on this. He may have some ideas that could be controversial, that may create concerns, but he needs the Congress to be with him, and definitely Congress is a very conservative, more central right, and I think that will going to prevail in the end.
Yeah, so Congress, keeping him more or less in the center. or when we talk about the business environment, there are many references to the so-called Brazil cost. Is he doing anything about bureaucracy? Is there anything that he can do to incentivize, or that he's planning at the moment, or that he has done so far related to specific help towards the growth of sectors within Brazil outside of Congress?
No, really, I think what we're going to have with Lula is a kind of the status quo. You could have some benefit there that would be quite beneficial for many sectors. On that area is okay. The promotion internationally, he's doing well. But I think by having the status quo and not meddling in the key sectors and respecting the framework and the policy, I think will be sufficient enough for foreign investors to really still have an interest in Brazil. For example, we don't expect him to meddle with agribusiness. On the contrary, I think he needs to support agribusiness in whichever capacity, because if we remember, he lost during the election in every agribusiness state. And he knows that politically this sector is very powerful in Brazil, so he needs really to be in good time with this sector. I think he's quite clear, quite pragmatic about that Brazil has to take out every drop of oil that is in the pre-salt. So we assume that on gas and oil policy, he's going to respect all the agreements that are there. And the other thing is that will benefit foreign investors is that Brazil is one of the pioneers in Latin America in energy transition, especially solar power and wind power. It's a very good framework for pricing, in which these days in Brazil, they are able to produce electricity at the same cost that hydropower. And also there is sufficient distribution lines to deliver that electricity. By having the right pricing and by having all the distribution lines, we expect investment in solar power and wind power in Brazil to grow very rapidly because the framework is the correct one. And I don't think Lula is going to meddle in that. As long as he respects that, I think the opportunity in that sector will be there.
Thank you, Carlos. To stay with you, Carlos, one question here on what you spoke about regarding the central bank. Do you see any risk in terms of the changes to the central bank governors coming up, or would your assessment stay the same?
I think the risk between now and 2024 is quite low. And the main reason is in the board of directors, the government doesn't have a majority. It's trying to influence that. I think it's 9 members. He appointed a few weeks back 2 members close to the finance minister, but still it doesn't make a majority. What you can see in the coming decision on interest rates, for example, is the president of the central bank having the upper hand and not having an unanimous decision. Why previously, when the central bank increases interest rates, normally it was an unanimous decision. What you're going to see possibly now is you could have 5 or 6 in favor of increasing interest rates, 3 against that. So it's going to be a divided vote, but still the majority will be with the central bank. Now, the current president of the central bank will be there until December 2024. From here and to there, a lot of things can change. He can appoint a different one in 2024, because the other option is Lula could actually renew the mandate of the current president of the central bank, or he will appoint another one. He possibly, by the comment he has made against the current one, he may appoint another one. And let's see that he tries somebody who may be closer to him. But the fact of the matter is the new president in 2024 still will be independent and cannot be fired by the president. And this is quite important, because if the new president of the central bank decided to take policies that are not the liking of President Lula can do nothing, because the law gives independence to that president of the central bank.
Thank you, Carlos. Rafael, how do you measure inflation expectations in Brazil? Are they surveys, financial market implied rates? What is the inflationary expectation now? What is your population growth expectation? And how will this impact long-term growth in Brazil?
With regards to the first questions, the central bank has its focus survey where it asked mostly the financial sector in Brazil about inflation expectations. They go by when they make their policy decisions. They don't have an econometric model that will get implied inflationary expectations. They just survey the financial analysts on the banks in Brazil, and they do ask inflation expectations. They have GDP forecasts. They ask many questions, but this is for inflation expectations in their forward-looking policy. And population in Brazil, we get most of the population forecast from the United Nations. We are expecting the population of Brazil to grow about 0.55% in the next few years. When I said there's a demographic bonus, I was talking more about labor force. And in our estimates, labor force stops growing in 2040 for Brazil. And so all these reforms that we're talking about and the prospects for the Brazilian economy in the longer term are based on the assumptions that structural reforms will progressively improve the ease of doing business in Brazil, along with capital investment with an increased capital stock. There will be a lot of productivity growth. When we talk about population in general, and particularly in Brazil, we also have to highlight that in our estimates, we don't have a sizable increase in labor participation, which may happen, especially in female labor participation, which could be an upside scenario for growth in the long term.
Thank you, Rafael. Two questions here for Elsa. One relates to how will Lula reconcile his desire for environmental protection with also the environmental ministry's need to strengthen permits with the environment. And the other one, it's related to you mentioning Mercosur and the EU agreement at the beginning. If you can expand a little bit more on the obstacles that are being presented at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, in terms of Lula and sustainability, Lula has made sustainability one of his key focuses throughout the campaigning period and going into his presidency as well. So what we're seeing as a result of that is much more effort to implement environmental regulation. Now, that environmental regulation, of course, already existed, but what we're looking at is much more enforcement of that. And as a result of that, we're seeing some delays with permits, like you mentioned. We're seeing some of these licensing issues. Just recently, we actually saw the environmental agency, IBAMA, rejecting a couple of licensing permits on environmental grounds. Now, this presents risks to projects in terms of delays and things like that, but it also presents a challenge to Lula because Lula also has to balance that focus on sustainability with a need to grow those key sectors. And as Carlos Caicedo pointed out as well, we do expect that Lula is going to focus on that key sector growth. He does want to expand oil and gas. We've talked about plans for that expansion, but it is going to potentially contradict some of these environmental plans that he has. So there's a risk there of inconsistent application of this regulation, and that increases reputational risks, particularly for those projects that are operating in the Amazon. So that could be these oil and gas projects that we're planning to explore at the mouth of the Amazon. It could also be infrastructure projects that are planned for that reason. Because in the past, we have seen boycotts of Brazilian products on this basis. And that brings us into the Mercosur question that you had. So a lot of the delays and obstacles that we're seeing around Mercosur are linked to efforts to impose new environmental standards and regulations, particularly surrounding deforestation. And not just surrounding deforestation, but also surrounding deforestation throughout supply chains of products that are being exported from Brazil. And this is where there's challenges because it's very difficult to enforce regulations that track that deforestation throughout the supply chain. And this is where we've seen these risks of boycotts. We have seen major retailers in the UK and the EU boycotting things like leather products and Brazilian beef based on these concerns. So this is definitely a balancing act that Lula is going to have to continue managing, especially with plans to host COP30 and things like that. This is going to have to continue being a focus, but without sacrificing that growth that Lula is really looking for as well.
Thanks, Elsa. Thank you, Rafael. And also thank you to all the panelists and of course to all of you, the listeners. Have a great day.
Thank you for listening to the Economics and Country Risk podcast. Connect with us on LinkedIn and Twitter, and don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode.